So let's start by taking a look at some variables. I have tried to make it clear to you all that this class starts at the absolute basics, the absolute beginning, and we can't really do any programming without understanding what a variable is. And a variable is really something that stores something. It stores something in a name, and it's a name that we can refer to as the programmer, if you will, because we understand what that name means. So if I wanted to make an integer, which is basically just a number without a decimal, I could say something like myInt, and then I could use an assignment operator. In this case, that's the equal, and let's say it's 10. Now I have declared something stored in a variable with 10. We could do a float. Again, these names can be whatever you want. That's another variable type. That one's a float. We can do a string. We'll just say first name, and this is going to be in quotes. And you can see that the script editor's giving me some highlighting here because it says, okay, this is a quote. One thing to note about Python is you could use single quotes as well. You can't mix them, but you can do one or the other. They don't matter. Now, there's something really interesting about Python that other programmers or programmers coming from other languages tend to really dislike, and that is the fact that this is a dynamic language, meaning that I haven't declared what type of variables these are, and they can change at any time. This is a blessing and a curse. I could actually go down here and say first name equals 190. And this is completely valid, right? So if I print first name here, it's going to print it. And if I print first name here, we get that. So it's basically been redeclared. You can't do this in a lot of other languages. A lot of languages are very careful about what variable types are, and they can't be interchanged. And then they're even careful about things like lists and arrays, and they have to have specific links and things like that. You'll find those in a lot of the highly managed languages like C++, because you really do have to be careful of how much data you're producing and how all this data interacts and how it's stored. And we just don't have that amount of control over here, nor do we need it because we're working in a very managed space. So Maya is handling all of the memory for us. It's handling all of the error reporting. All we really have to do is just work with the basics of the language and do be mindful that these dynamics make it a lot easier to write Python, but you can also get caught up in it. Okay, so one of the great things about Python as well is we can, most languages have a way to use arithmetic operators or to concatenate strings together. That's me. So I could say my int plus a float. Okay, and let's print that out. And what we're going to get up here is 13.14. So we made a very, very basic calculator. I can also do print first name plus last name. And this is concatenation. So we're tying two strings together, okay? And if I want to put a space in there, very easy, I'm just gonna add a space. Oops. We can do things like this. We can say, let's say, we can use some multipliers for this as well. We could print, oops, apologize again for my super clacky keyboard. Print 10 times, let's put a little string in here like that. And we get that. There are some ways to break this. And you just have to be mindful of what these are. I could say something like print myInt plus first name. And that's not going to work because you can't add an int and a string. But you can add two strings together, and you could add two integers together. So these are kind of just rules you're going to have to get used to. I could convert, if I wanted to actually print these two things together, I could convert my int to a string by using the Python function str. We'll get into that stuff later on, but then it's going to work, okay? All right, so we used an assignment operator here to assign our variables. These variables at this point are global. Don't worry about that yet. When we talk about functions in the next couple classes, it'll become clear what that means. But because we're working in Maya, you should be aware that when we declare a global variable like these ones, they're in memory until the Maya process is terminated. So until we actually shut down Autodesk Maya, these are being stored in memory. This can be problematic if we're also running other scripts with global variables that have the same names. So we're going to try to use as few global variables as possible, and we're basically going to move to variables that are scoped to the functions that they're contained in. And again, we'll talk about that more next class. Okay, so a couple other types of, I'm going to do a whole video on lists next, but we also have lists, and we can call this, a list is stored in square brackets, and it can contain any type of data. Like that. There's another type. We'll talk about how to process this in the next video. And we have Booleans. You'll see if you start to type something and it's owned by Python, it will make it green, and you probably shouldn't use that. There are a whole bunch of those that you probably shouldn't use if you're trying to make variable names. I had a long discussion with a programmer friend of mine once about how long can we make variable names before they start to affect the performance of what you're doing. And for what we're doing, make them as long as you want. It doesn't really matter. And eventually, we're going to be using, when we switch over to a Python editor, it will autocomplete variable names for us. So fewer error problems, potential for error there as well, less potential for error. So let's do a quick Boolean. This is going to be true or false with capital letters. And these are our main variable types. We got integers, floats, strings, lists, and Booleans.